I remember the weight of that day as if it were pressed into my chest. My husband's funeral had barely passed. The scent of lilies still clung to the black dress I had worn, and my home was quiet in a way that felt unnatural, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. People said I was strong, that I carried myself with grace. But inside, I was hollow, grieving a man I thought I knew, a partner I trusted for decades. A week later, I forced myself out of the house for the first time since burying him. My best friend Rachel invited me to her little boy's first birthday. She said it would be good for me, that being around laughter and balloons might help me breathe again. So I went, even though every step toward her door felt heavier than the last. The living room was bright, colorful, full of noise. Children ran past my knees with frosting on their cheeks, and parents made small talk over paper cups of punch. I smiled politely, but inside I was somewhere else, still staring at that casket lowered into the ground. I told myself I could endure an hour, maybe two, just long enough to show support for Rachel, the friend I thought had always stood by me. But then the room shifted. It started with the sound of a fork clinking against a glass. Rachel stood up in the center of the crowd, her son balanced on her hip, and asked for silence. Everyone turned toward her with curiosity. I expected her to thank us for coming, to say a few words about motherhood. But instead, she looked straight at me, her eyes steady, her chin lifted, and said words that cracked open the floor beneath my feet. She announced, calmly, almost proudly, that her son was not just hers. He was mine as well in a way, because according to her, the child belonged to my husband. She said it as if it were a toast, as if she were sharing good news. The laughter died instantly. The chatter faded. Dozens of eyes moved from her face to mine, waiting for me to crumble. Then she went further. With a sharpness in her tone that cut through the silence, Rachel declared that because her son was fathered by my husband, she deserved a claim on my life, my stability, my security. Half of my home, our $950,000 house, was hers by right. She said it so firmly, as if daring anyone to challenge her. And as if the words themselves weren't enough, she reached into her bag and pulled out papers. She waved them high, pages that looked far too official for a birthday party. A will. My husband's will. The air grew heavy. A few people gasped. Others stared at me with pity, some with judgment. Rachel's voice rang out, declaring that she had proof, that my late husband had already written her child into his legacy. She was ready to humiliate me in front of friends, family, and strangers alike. I sat frozen, my fingers pressed against my knees, my heart pounding so loud I thought the room could hear it. But on my face I kept calm. I didn't lash out. I didn't weep. I simply nodded, almost as if I were agreeing, though inside my thoughts were racing. Because in that moment, I remembered something Rachel didn't know. She believed she had cornered me with her declaration. She thought those pages would strip me of dignity, of stability, of everything my husband had left behind. But what she didn't realize was this: my husband had left me something far more powerful than she could ever imagine. And that was the moment I knew this story was only beginning. If this is your first time coming across one of our stories, welcome. Please hit the like button and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. And don't scroll away, because what happened next no one saw coming. And if you enjoy stories like this, be sure to subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. When people looked at Michael and me, they often said we were the kind of couple others envied. He had that easy charm, the kind that could light up a room. And I carried myself with quiet confidence, proud of the life we were building together. To outsiders we looked steady, untouchable, almost like a picture-perfect family plucked from the glossy pages of a magazine. Michael worked hard and his success showed. He was charismatic, a natural leader, someone who made friends wherever he went. In our neighborhood, people trusted him, admired him. He had a way of listening that made you feel seen, even if you weren't the only one in the conversation. And for years I believed all of that belonged only to me, that charm, that loyalty, that affection. We built our home brick by brick, dream by dream. I still remember when we bought the $950,000 house. It wasn't just a house to us. It was the result of years of sacrifice, long nights, and careful planning. Each corner carried our fingerprints. The garden we planted together, the photographs of our travels framed neatly on the walls, the kitchen where he loved to experiment with recipes while I laughed at his mess. Everything about it spoke of partnership, stability, a shared future. And then there was Rachel. She had been in my life since childhood, the kind of friend people say is more like family. We grew up side by side, survived heartbreaks, celebrated milestones. When Michael entered my life, she was there cheering me on. She stood beside me at my wedding, adjusting my veil, whispering that I was the luckiest woman alive. I trusted her with secrets I told no one else. She knew the rhythm of my life, the details of my marriage, the moments I felt proud, and the moments I felt weak. In those early years, it never crossed my mind to question her loyalty. She came by often, almost too often, but I brushed it off as friendship. She knew where I kept the spare key. She knew which nights Michael worked late. She knew when I traveled, and she knew how lonely the house could feel without him in it. At first, I thought it was kindness, her way of making sure I wasn't alone. But now, looking back, I realize she had more access to my marriage than anyone should ever have. Michael, too, welcomed her presence. He'd smile when she walked through the door, pour her a glass of wine, and include her in conversations like she belonged to our inner circle. Sometimes I caught a flicker of something in the way she looked at him, something sharper, deeper, than friendship should allow. But I silenced those thoughts. Rachel was my best friend. She had been my anchor through storms. I couldn't imagine her as anything else. Still, there were moments that gnawed at me quietly, like faint scratches on a locked door. Michael would leave the house with vague explanations, errands that stretched late into the night, business calls that required privacy. I never pressed too hard. He was successful, busy, responsible. I convinced myself he deserved trust. But trust without clarity is fragile, and those little unexplained absences started to echo in my mind. At gatherings, I noticed Rachel laughing at his jokes a little too freely, leaning in a little too close. I noticed Michael watching her sometimes, his gaze lingering a beat too long before flicking back to me. They never crossed a line in front of me, never gave me outright proof. But my instincts whispered that something was out of place, something I wasn't supposed to see. Still, I told myself I was imagining it. Rachel was like a sister. Michael was my husband. The people closest to me couldn't be the ones to betray me. At least, that's what I believed. So I buried the unease under layers of excuses. I focused on our home, our life, our plans. I told myself that every marriage has its shadows, that I was overthinking, that love was enough to smooth out the rough edges. But unease has a way of growing in silence. It doesn't shout. It lingers, waits, and then surfaces when you least expect it. At the time, I didn't know how much those small moments, the unexplained disappearances, the glances, the closeness, would matter. I didn't know they were the cracks in the foundation of a life I thought was unshakable. Because while I was busy protecting what I thought was ours, the two people I trusted most were weaving a secret of their own. And though I couldn't see it fully then, one day that secret would stand up in the middle of a crowded room and tear open my world. Rachel had always been present in my life, but after Michael and I settled into marriage, her presence seemed to multiply. She had a way of inserting herself into our daily rhythm, slipping through the cracks of privacy that should have belonged only to us. At first it looked like devotion, the actions of a friend who cared too much. But looking back now, I see it for what it was, a slow, steady intrusion. She would stop by unannounced, holding a bottle of wine or a batch of cookies as if those offerings excused her timing. Sometimes I would come home from work and find her already in the living room with Michael, laughing at some story I wasn't part of. Other times she would text me about Michael's schedule, what time his meetings ended, when he was traveling, information I hadn't even known myself. I used to laugh it off, saying Rachel had a memory like steel, that she was simply observant. But there were nights when I lay awake wondering how she knew so much. It was the kind of knowledge that came from more than observation. It was intimacy disguised as attentiveness. I brushed it off because who suspects their best friend? The girl who stood beside me at prom, who held my hand during my father's funeral, who knew every scar and triumph of my youth. I convinced myself she was simply over-involved, that it was part of her personality, that it meant nothing. To question her felt like questioning the foundation of my own life. Still, the moments piled up. Small, almost invisible signs that, once stacked together, began to form a picture I refused to see. One evening, I planned a surprise dinner for Michael. I cooked his favorite meal, lit candles, and waited for him to come home. But as the clock ticked past 8, then 9, then 10, my excitement withered into worry. I called his phone, no answer. I told myself he must be caught up at work. But the next day, Rachel casually mentioned she had seen him out late, working on important projects. She even joked about how dedicated he was. I hadn't told her he never came home that night. How could she have known? Another time, Michael returned from a business trip, and Rachel showed up the very next morning with a gift for him, a book from the very city he had just visited. I remember standing there, holding the empty coffee mug in my hand, wondering how she even knew where he had gone. He hadn't shared those details with me. When I asked, Michael laughed it off, saying Rachel was just thoughtful, that she probably guessed. But guesses don't usually come wrapped in gift paper with perfect accuracy. At family gatherings the shift was subtle but I felt it. Rachel positioned herself close to Michael, laughing at his jokes with just a touch too much warmth, brushing against his arm as if by accident. When I entered the room, they would spring apart slightly, rearranging themselves into a picture of innocence. It was nothing anyone else would have noticed, but a wife knows. A wife feels it in her gut. One afternoon I returned early from an appointment. I walked into my kitchen and heard laughter echoing from the backyard. There they were, Rachel and Michael, seated close on the patio, talking in low voices that stopped the second they noticed me. Rachel greeted me with her usual smile, the kind that stretched wide enough to hide what lingered behind it. Michael kissed my cheek, asked about my day, and everything seemed normal again. But the silence I had interrupted hung in the air, unspoken yet undeniable. My mind wrestled with the contradictions. Rachel was my confidant. Michael was my husband. They were the two people who were supposed to be my safe place. To even consider that they might be betraying me felt like setting fire to the life I had worked so hard to build. So I pushed it aside. I convinced myself I was overthinking, jealous even. That grief from my father's passing and the pressures of marriage had made me paranoid. But unease doesn't vanish when you bury it. It festers, waiting for the right moment to expose itself. I told myself it was nothing, but my body knew better. The tightness in my chest whenever Rachel lingered too long. The sharp sting in my stomach when Michael laughed too easily in her presence. The way their eyes met when they thought no one was watching. It's strange how betrayal leaves clues long before it becomes undeniable. It doesn't crash in suddenly. It seeps slow and deliberate, until it's impossible to ignore. The signs had been scattered across my life like breadcrumbs, but I had chosen not to follow them. Because what woman wants to walk down a path that ends in the collapse of everything she thought was true? But the truth doesn't care about your denial. It waits. Patient, steady, certain. And in my case, it wasn't waiting quietly. It was standing right in front of me, smiling, holding my child's birthday invitation, pretending to be my friend. What I didn't realize back then was that the truth had been staring me in the face all along. I had simply been too afraid to look it in the eyes. Michael's death came without warning. One moment, life carried on with its steady rhythm, the workdays, the evenings filled with routine conversations, the plans for a future we thought was still stretched out before us. The next, it was all over. The call came late at night. A voice on the other end telling me words I couldn't process. Accident, gone, final. My knees buckled under me, and I remember clutching the edge of the counter to keep from collapsing. The house felt suddenly enormous, empty, as though it knew it had lost its keeper. The days that followed blurred into each other. Grief has a way of distorting time. Hours stretched like years, and yet entire days disappeared as though stolen. I would wake in the morning and forget for one fleeting second that he was gone, only to have reality crush me the moment my eyes adjusted to the light. The silence in the house became unbearable. His toothbrush still rested by the sink. His jacket hung on the back of the chair. His cologne lingered in the bedroom like a ghost. Everywhere I looked, I found proof of a life that had ended too soon. When the funeral came, I moved like a body on autopilot. People filled the church. Faces I hadn't seen in years, all wearing black, all whispering their condolences as though words could soften the blow. I nodded, thanked them, let their hands squeeze mine. But inside I was detached, watching myself from somewhere far away. The coffin at the front was unbearable. The polished wood, the flowers arranged neatly on top, the nameplate engraved with finality, it all seemed like a cruel trick. Michael had always been so full of energy, a man who could command a room with a single laugh. To see him reduced to a box lowered into the earth broke something inside me that could never be repaired. Then there was his family. Coldness radiated from them, subtle but sharp. His sister avoided my gaze, her lips pressed in a thin line. His brother lingered in corners, speaking in hushed tones with relatives, casting glances my way that felt more like judgment than sympathy. Even his mother, who had once embraced me as her own daughter, seemed distant, her hug stiff, her eyes heavy with something unspoken. I caught fragments of conversations, snatches about property, about money, about what Michael had left behind. In the shadow of his death, greed whispered louder than love. Rachel, of course, was everywhere. She arrived early, stayed late, and positioned herself close to me as though she were my shield. She held my hand through the service, fetched me water when my throat felt too dry to swallow, whispered assurances in my ear. To anyone watching, she looked like the perfect friend, the one constant presence who refused to leave me to face the storm alone. But I noticed things. The way she carried herself with a strange confidence, as though she were not just a mourner but someone with a role larger than the rest. She moved through the rooms of my home as if she belonged there, answering questions from guests, directing people as though it were her place. She lingered near the will when Michael's documents were mentioned, her eyes flickering in a way that told me she knew something. At night, when everyone had gone and the house fell silent again, I would lie in bed and think about Rachel's presence. It should have been comforting, yet it unsettled me. She was too attentive, too present, too sure of herself. I began to feel as though she wasn't there just for me. She was there for him, for Michael, and for whatever he had left behind. Loneliness pressed against me from every side. Grief hollowed me out. The people I expected to lean on, his family, seemed distant, their warmth replaced by suspicion. My best friend filled that void, but her closeness came with an edge I couldn't ignore. I found myself clinging to her presence one moment, and questioning it the next. The funeral marked the end of Michael's life, but it was also the beginning of a darker season for me. I thought burying him was the hardest part. I thought the pain of loss was the greatest wound I would have to carry. But as I stood there, watching the coffin disappear beneath the earth, I couldn't shake the sense that this wasn't just the end of my husband's life, it was the unraveling of the truth I had refused to face. I walked away from that cemetery with my heart shattered, my home colder than ever, and my faith in the people around me beginning to crumble. I had no idea that the very friend holding my arm, guiding me to the car, was preparing to turn my grief into her opportunity. And though I couldn't see it fully then, the betrayal was already in motion. It had been for years. The funeral was only the stage where grief and greed would meet, and I was about to discover that my sorrow was just the beginning of the storm Rachel had been waiting to unleash. It had been a few weeks since Michael's funeral, and though the sharpest edge of grief still cut me every morning, I forced myself to show up when Rachel invited me to her son's first birthday party. She had been insistent, almost too insistent, that I attend. She claimed it would help me smile again, that seeing children laugh and families gather would remind me that life continued even in the shadow of death. A part of me resisted, but another part, hollow and weary, accepted. Maybe I needed a distraction. Maybe I needed to feel something other than emptiness. Her house was decorated with balloons in pale blues and silvers, streamers curling down from the ceiling, the smell of frosted cake drifting through the air. Guests moved about with drinks in their hands, laughter rippling across the room. For a moment I stood at the edge, watching the celebration unfold. It was jarring, how easily joy filled this house while mine remained steeped in silence. Rachel greeted me with a wide smile, pulling me into a hug that felt staged, too rehearsed. "You came," she whispered as though she had doubted I would. Her eyes scanned me quickly, almost like she was checking whether grief had weakened me enough for whatever she had planned. I stayed polite, drifting between conversations, accepting slices of cake, smiling at children toddling across the floor. I told myself I was imagining the way Rachel kept glancing at me, her expression hovering between excitement and anticipation. Something about her energy unsettled me, but I pushed it aside. Then, when the candles had been blown out and the chatter was at its peak, Rachel cleared her throat and called for attention. The room quieted, glasses clinked down onto tables, and everyone turned toward her. She held her son in her arms, beaming as though the world itself should bow to this moment. "I want to thank you all for coming to celebrate my little boy's first year," she began, her voice smooth and confident. "It means so much to have family and friends here to witness this milestone." I clapped softly with the rest, expecting the usual sentimental speech about motherhood, love, and gratitude. But her next words struck like a knife. She lifted her chin, her voice louder now, carrying across the hushed room. "But there's something I need to share. Something I've kept inside for too long. This little boy," she kissed her son's cheek, "is not just mine. He is Michael's son. And that means half of the $950,000 home he left behind belongs to me." The room erupted into stunned silence. A few gasps pierced the air, followed by the scrape of a chair as someone sat back too hard. My heart thudded, not with shock, but with a strange, steady clarity. Around me, faces turned, eyes darting between Rachel and me, waiting for a reaction. Rachel's smile didn't falter. In fact, it widened as though she relished the spectacle. Her words hung in the air like smoke, poisonous and thick, choking the celebration. Whispers began, quick, harsh, judgmental. Some guests looked at me with pity, others with suspicion. I could feel the weight of humiliation pressing down, but instead of breaking, I found myself strangely calm. I met Rachel's eyes across the room. She expected tears. She expected outrage, denial, maybe even a dramatic collapse. She wanted me to crumble under the revelation she had orchestrated in front of everyone. But I simply nodded, my lips curving into the faintest smile. I wasn't laughing, not yet, but inside something sharp and almost bitter stirred. I had spent weeks drowning in grief, but this moment lifted me out of the fog. Rachel thought she had delivered a fatal blow, but all she had done was reveal herself fully. Her greed, her arrogance, her need to humiliate me to justify her claim. So I nodded, calm and deliberate, and when the silence grew unbearable, I whispered just loud enough for those nearest to hear. I see. Then, as though nothing had been said, I lifted my glass of water to my lips, unbothered, unmoved. The room shifted. Guests exchanged uneasy looks, some avoiding Rachel's gaze, others studying me with confusion. My calm unsettled them more than any outburst could have. Rachel's smile faltered for just a second, a flicker of frustration crossing her face. She hadn't expected composure, she had expected collapse. But collapse was not in me anymore. I had buried my husband. I had stood before his coffin and survived the suffocating weight of loss. There was nothing Rachel could say that could wound me deeper than death already had. And so, as she stood there clutching her child like a trophy, waiting for me to break, I simply nodded again, trying not to laugh at the audacity. Because in that moment, I realized Rachel's revelation wasn't a weapon. It was a confession. And confessions, no matter how shocking, always came with consequences. I need you to breathe. I wasn't ready for that twist either. If your heart just dropped, tap the like button. It tells me I'm not the only one who felt it. Rachel wasn't finished. Her announcement had already poisoned the air, but she thrived on spectacle, on pushing the knife in deeper. As murmurs spread across the room, she bent down, reached beneath the cake table, and pulled out a brown envelope. With a dramatic flourish, she slid out a stack of papers and held them high for everyone to see. This, she declared, her voice laced with triumph, is Michael's will. Proof of everything I've just said. Gasps rippled again. Guests leaned forward, eyes narrowing, necks craning as though they might glimpse the truth from across the room. Rachel shook the papers like a preacher waving scripture, convinced that ink on paper would cement her claim. I watched in silence, my glass still in hand, though the water now trembled with each beat of my pulse. She wanted me cornered, exposed. She wanted my dignity stripped before the same people who had comforted me at my husband's funeral. She began to read aloud, or at least to pretend. Her voice carried phrases about assets, about division, about rights. She twisted words as though each one was a dagger meant for me. Her audience drank it in. I could feel the tide turning, faces softening toward her, eyes sharpening against me. See, she said, clutching her son closer, her smile widening with every stolen breath of authority. Michael wanted us cared for. He wanted this house to be partly mine, because this boy is his blood. I felt the weight of every gaze settle on me. Judgment, curiosity, even suspicion. Whispers rose around me. Did she know? Could this be true? Maybe Rachel has a right. It was astonishing how quickly sympathy shifted. How quickly the widow became the outsider. Inside me a storm churned. Grief that had barely begun to heal ripped open again. Betrayal clawed through my chest like a living thing. My husband's absence was no longer only the silence in my bed, the emptiness at the dinner table. It was now a shadow wrapped around a secret he had never confessed. For a heartbeat, rage surged. I wanted to scream, to tear the papers from Rachel's hand, to demand answers from a man who could no longer give them. I wanted to collapse under the weight of humiliation. But I did none of those things. I breathed. Slowly, deliberately. I let the storm thrash inside me, but refused to let it spill out. I remembered Michael's hand holding mine when he was sick, his whispered promises that I would be secure. I remembered the late nights he spent in his study, scribbling documents, sealing envelopes. I remembered the quiet look in his eyes when he told me, "Not everything is as it seems, but trust me, you'll be fine." At the time, I thought he was speaking about illness, about death. Now, standing in that room filled with suspicion and betrayal, I realized his words had been a warning. So I stayed still. I let Rachel speak. I let her bask in her stolen glory. I let her enjoy the gasps and nods, the subtle approval of those too quick to believe. And when the room grew quiet again, waiting for my collapse, I simply folded my hands in my lap and said, "If that's what you believe, Rachel, then hold tight to it." The calmness unsettled her. I saw it in the twitch of her lips, the way her hand gripped the papers just a little too tightly. She had expected fire, not ice. My silence dragged on, long enough for whispers to swell once more. Some thought I was guilty, cornered. Others thought I was broken, too defeated to fight. But inside I was neither. Inside I was calculating. Because while Rachel believed she held all the cards, I knew something she didn't. I had seen the real will, the one Michael had entrusted me with long before his death. I had sat with the lawyer who drafted it, had listened to every clause and signature. I knew where every penny was meant to go, where every property was meant to land. And nowhere was Rachel's name. Michael had anticipated this. He had prepared me for the storm long before I knew its shape. Rachel thought she was unveiling a secret, but all she had unveiled was her own desperation. So I let the room judge me. I let them whisper. I let Rachel wave her counterfeit papers like a flag of victory. And while she believed she was dismantling me piece by piece, I was already building the quiet foundation of my revenge. I sipped the last of my water, the glass steady now, my hand no longer trembling. When I set it down, I lifted my eyes and looked at Rachel, really looked at her. And with a calmness that sliced sharper than any scream, I said, "You've revealed so much tonight. But Rachel, are you sure you've revealed everything?" Her smile faltered, just for an instant. A flicker of doubt passed through her eyes. And in that crack, in that sliver of hesitation, I felt the balance shift. She thought she had cornered me, but she didn't know. Her game had only just begun. The moment Rachel's smile faltered, I felt a strange calm take root inside me. Not the shaky calm of someone suppressing rage, but the solid, unshakable calm of a woman holding a secret weapon. Because the truth was, Rachel was already chasing a ghost. The papers she clung to so desperately were nothing more than remnants of a past Michael himself had buried. What she brandished as proof was, in reality, a relic, outdated, irrelevant, powerless. I remembered the night Michael finally confessed. A night when the weight of illness pressed on his chest and honesty slipped out like fragile smoke. He had reached for my hand, his grip weak but steady enough to anchor me. His voice was hoarse, but each word carved itself into my memory. "I changed everything," he whispered. "The old will, it doesn't matter anymore. I made sure of it. I left you secure. I left you the truth. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." At the time I didn't fully understand the depth of what he meant. I thought he was soothing me, easing my fear of a future without him. But later, when I sat in the quiet office of his lawyer, I understood. The documents laid before me were clear, precise, ironclad. The estate, the house, every ounce of security, sealed in my name. Michael had tied the knots so tightly, not even a desperate hand could loosen them. And yet, I said nothing to Rachel. Not then, not now. Silence was my shield, and patience my weapon. In the days after his funeral, while grief still clung to me like a shroud, I had taken steps Rachel could never imagine. Quiet steps, deliberate ones. I met with attorneys in discreet offices. I sat through long explanations of probate law, of clauses designed to prevent fraudulent claims, of safeguards Michael himself had insisted upon. I signed papers, filed documents, secured accounts. I placed keys and deeds in a safety deposit box where only my fingerprints could reach them. Every move was made under the cover of mourning, unnoticed by those who thought I was too broken to function. Rachel, on the other hand, had been busy rehearsing her performance. She paraded her so-called proof, convinced that volume and drama could outweigh legality and truth. She had no idea that every gesture, every word, every triumphant smile only dug her deeper into the pit she had created for herself. As I sat in that room, watching her bask in attention, I realized something remarkable. I wasn't afraid anymore. The fear that had haunted me since her announcement was gone. In its place was a quiet confidence, a strength I hadn't known I possessed. She thought she was writing my downfall, but in truth she was performing the opening act of her own undoing. I replayed Michael's last words in my mind, not with sorrow but with gratitude. He had anticipated this storm, and he had prepared me for it. In his final acts, he had protected me, not by leaving me wealth alone, but by leaving me foresight. He had given me the tools to outlast betrayal, to survive humiliation, to rise above deceit. So I sat composed while Rachel reveled. I allowed her to build her tower of lies higher and higher, knowing that the taller it grew, the harder it would crumble. I let the family murmur and doubt because doubt was fickle. It shifted easily, and when the truth emerged, their whispers would turn like wind against her. Inside, my plan was already forming. Not the loud revenge of shouts and accusations, but the silent revenge of exposure. The kind that doesn't just strip away pride but leaves nothing to cling to. I would not fight her in this room, not in front of wide eyes and wagging tongues. No, my revenge would be slow, deliberate, undeniable. I thought of the lawyer, of the sealed envelope resting quietly in his office safe. I thought of the dates, the signatures, the witnesses, the stamps of authority that no one could dispute. Rachel might hold paper, but I held truth. And truth, in the hands of a patient woman, was sharper than any weapon. The strength I felt surprised me. It wasn't the strength of defiance, but of clarity. For so long I had seen myself as a grieving widow, fragile, cornered, diminished. But in that moment I saw what Michael had seen in me all along, a woman capable of withstanding storms, of facing betrayal without breaking, of turning heartbreak into fire. I didn't need to shout, I didn't need to argue. All I needed was silence. Silence that unsettled her. Silence that whispered of knowledge she didn't possess. Silence that made her question her own victory. Because revenge, I knew, wasn't always about striking first. Sometimes it was about standing so still, so calm, that your enemy unraveled under the weight of their own lies. And as I sat there, hands folded, eyes steady, I promised myself, Rachel would unravel, piece by piece. She thought the house was hers to claim. She thought my grief made me weak. She thought forged papers could erase the truth. But soon, very soon, she would learn that betrayal always circles back, and silence is not weakness, it is the prelude to justice. The day of reckoning did not arrive with thunder. It came quietly, as most truths often do, slipping through polished corridors and into a room where only the brave dared breathe deeply. The lawyer's office was calm, too calm for the storm it was about to host. I sat in a chair that felt heavier than it should have, hands folded, eyes steady, waiting. Rachel arrived as though the world already belonged to her. Her heels clicked with arrogance, her smile rehearsed and radiant, her son trailing behind her like a reluctant shadow. She carried herself with the air of someone stepping into a coronation, not realizing she was walking into her undoing. The lawyer, an older man with kind but unyielding eyes, greeted her with the civility she did not deserve. His desk was stacked with documents, sealed envelopes, the kind of papers that do not bend to theatrics or entitlement. Rachel didn't wait to be asked. She launched into her speech, once again presenting her brittle copy of the will, waving it as though its ink carried divine authority. She spoke of her son's rights, of Michael's supposed promises, of what she believed was owed. She laughed lightly, even glancing at me, as if expecting to see me shatter beneath her words. But I did not move. My silence unnerved her more than any outburst could. Finally, the lawyer lifted his hand, signaling an end to her tirade. He opened a thick folder, placed it neatly on the table, and slid it across toward her. His voice was calm, deliberate, each word cutting through her performance like glass. "Mrs. Daniels," he said firmly, "the document you are holding is no longer valid. Your copy references a will that was superseded years ago. Michael Daniels executed a new will, duly witnessed and notarized, that voided all previous versions." Rachel blinked, confusion flashing before indignation set in. She shook her head, laughed nervously, demanded clarity. But the lawyer continued, steady as a metronome, his words unstoppable. "In the most recent will, signed and filed with this office, Michael Daniels removed both you and your son from any inheritance claim. Every asset, real estate, accounts, personal belongings, was placed solely in his wife's name. This decision was clear, intentional, and legally binding." The room grew silent, except for the sound of Rachel's breath quickening. The confidence that once draped her shoulders like silk began to crumble, thread by thread. She flipped through the documents with trembling hands, her smile collapsing into disbelief. Her son sat beside her, his eyes downcast, refusing to meet mine. Perhaps he had known deep down that lies built on greed rarely survive daylight. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. My revenge wasn't in raised voices or accusations. It was in the stillness of truth finally unveiled. I sat calm, watching her unravel beneath the weight of her own audacity. The lawyer leaned back, his voice final. "Mrs. Daniels," he said, "there is nothing here for you to claim. Everything belongs to your late husband's rightful wife. The matter is closed." Rachel's face drained of color. The woman who once stood tall in her arrogance now shrank into the very chair she had stormed into. She looked at me then, not with triumph but with disbelief, as if trying to reconcile the silence I had carried with the victory now resting in my hands. I met her gaze steadily. Not a word passed my lips, but the message was clear. I didn't need to fight you. The truth fought for me. When the meeting ended, I walked out into the afternoon light, the air cool against my skin, my heart steady in my chest. For the first time since Michael's funeral, I felt free, not just from Rachel's schemes, but from the shadows of betrayal. My revenge had not been loud. It had not been cruel. It had been silent, patient, and absolute. And in that silence I reclaimed everything she tried to take. My dignity, my peace, my power. As I closed the door on that chapter of my life, I whispered a quiet thank you to Michael. He had trusted me to be strong. He had left me the truth, and I had carried it through fire without letting it burn me. Rachel faded behind me, her empire of lies reduced to dust. And I walked forward, not as the woman she tried to destroy, but as the woman who rose unbroken. When I finally stepped away from that chapter of my life, I realized that silence had been my sharpest weapon. While Rachel plotted loudly, I prepared quietly. While she shouted her demands, I let the law, the truth, and time speak for me. And in the end, her voice collapsed under the weight of its own emptiness. Betrayal is a wound that cuts deeper than any knife, because it comes from those we once allowed close to our hearts. It lingers, it festers, and it whispers that we are weak. But I learned something in those long nights alone, replaying Michael's confession, clutching the papers he left behind. Weakness is not in the tears we shed. It is in giving up before the fight is over. Strength is found in patience, in preparation, in refusing to be dragged into the mud where your enemies wait. Sometimes, the loudest revenge is silence and preparation. I did not need to scream to be heard. I did not need to expose every betrayal the moment I discovered it. I let Rachel believe she was winning, because her own arrogance built the trap she eventually fell into. My silence unnerved her, my composure unsettled her, and my patience became the noose she tied for herself. To every woman who has been betrayed, who has been underestimated, who has been pushed aside, hear me. Your worth is not defined by their lies. Your strength does not vanish because someone tried to take what was yours. You carry within you the power to outlast storms, to rise from heartbreak, and to rebuild from ashes they thought would bury you. Do not rush to prove them wrong. Let the truth work for you. Let your preparation protect you. Let your silence be the storm they never see coming. I carried the weight of secrets, of heartbreak, of betrayal so sharp it threatened to break me, but instead of breaking I bent. I bent in silence until the day I could stand unshaken. And when that day came I did not need to roar. I simply stood in my truth, and it was enough to bring their empire crumbling down. There is peace in knowing that I never had to become cruel to survive cruelty. I never had to become deceitful to defeat deceit. My victory was clean, and that is why it will last. Rachel may try to spin her stories, to play the victim in the eyes of those who do not know better. But I know the truth. Michael knew the truth. And the law recorded it in ink that cannot be erased. Betrayal may break your heart, but it cannot break your destiny. Heartbreak may shake your world, but it cannot shake your purpose. And secrets, no matter how dark, eventually surface when the time is right. All you have to do is be patient enough, strong enough, and wise enough to let them. I walked away not just with my home, my life, and my dignity intact. I walked away with something far greater. I walked away with proof that no one, no betrayal, no scheming voice, can take from me the strength I built in silence. That is the kind of revenge no courtroom can measure, and no thief can steal. So to the women listening, remember this. Never rush to shout your strength. Let it simmer, let it grow, let it rise when the moment is right. Protect yourself, protect your future, protect your peace. Because sometimes, the most powerful victories are won without a sound. And when I finally closed the door on Rachel and her empty claims, I felt the calm of knowing she had lost before she even began. I didn't just survive her betrayal. I turned it into the very stage where my strength was revealed. Because in the end, I already won. And that was my story. If it gave you chills, if it reminded you that strength doesn't always roar, it sometimes whispers, make sure you subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and stay with me for more true stories of betrayal, secrets, heartbreaks, and silent revenge. Until next time.